This is the Knafs Lander V2, and this is a thoroughly decent button lock. Well, it's not really anything better than that. So this is the second, I think it's just the second knife that he's done under Knafs. So Knafs is Ben, used to be the face of Blade HQ. Came into the knife world. His first knife design were the banters that he did with Wii. I've got a banter here, review coming up soon on that one. And his banter designs did very well. They were very popular for very good reason. And then he started, well, Knafs as a company existed prior to that. They would do accessories, merchandise, stuff like that. And then I believe it was Kickstarter, might have been Indiegogo, debuted first the Knafs Lander 1, which was smaller than this one and was a liner lock and was made by QSP. The Knafs Lander 2 came out last year, 2023, is a clutch lock, meaning an axis lock, is made by Kaiser. And this one here is in, does it say here? Yeah, S35VN. It's also a little bit larger than the Lander V1. And typical with Ben's designs, this is an EDC design. It's a simple, inoffensive knife design in bright colors. I mean, you can get a fully blacked out version, but even then, the blade shape is inoffensive. The handle shape is inoffensive. There's no tactical jimping or sharp points or anything like that. These are meant to be nice, simple EDC knives. And it is that. Just recognize that there are some limitations with a simple EDC knife, especially when you're used to, carrying stuff like a Manix or a Native or something like that, knives that are meant to be used a little bit harder. Then you start to see how a very neutral design like this can have some challenges. So let's go through some specs. This is a $130 knife. Again, it's made by Kaiser in China. 3.25 inches of blade here. 1/10 of an inch, so 100 thousandths. 100 thousandths? Yeah. On the no. Yes. On the blade stock here, S35VN on your blade. And this whole knife weighs 2.9 ounces. So not heavy. 2.9 ounces for 3.25 inches of blade. That is fine. And $130 for a knife made by Kaiser. That is fine. That's in line, generally speaking, with Kaiser's own knives of similar materials and fit and finish and things like that. So let's just go through the fit and finish first because it is solid. And it is what you would expect for a $130 Chinese-made knife in 2023 or 2024. You have a relatively nice stone wash here. The blade is competent. It's a very simple blade design. It's a spear point in terms of its shape, and especially if you sort of ignore the swedge here and just picture if this was swedgeless or if it was more traditional spear point with sort of the swedge down the middle there. It is pretty neutral coming up to a tip that's right in line with your pivot here. Carries the full blade stock thickness pretty far out. So this ends up being a fairly thick blade behind the edge. It's not thick, but it's not thin either, but it doesn't have much space to drop, and you do start to feel that when you start to cut with it, but we'll get into blade a little bit more later. Let's finish fit and finish. You've got some pretty standard thumb studs here. This axis lock rendition. So again, this is the clutch lock. It is an axis lock. I believe you've got adjustable axis lock tension in there, as I recall. I haven't felt the need to adjust it. This came right for me out of the box. The action on this, I'm just going to call it an axis lock, feels almost exactly like a Benchmade 940 to me. Like, honestly, if you handed me, if there was a 940 here or a 940 here and a Lander here, and I couldn't feel the difference in the handle, if you could just pull out the locks, I would say this lock feels identical to that of a Benchmade 940. Part of that is because this blade is about the same weight as the blade of a Benchmade 940. It's a little thicker, a little shorter. And so it ends up having the very same sort of very drop shutty action when you pull that log back. The actual resistance on the open is pretty strong, a little bit stronger maybe than the 940. So, you can fail it if you want to, but if you put any effort into it, it'll pop out pretty nicely. It's a very nice axis lock action. It's not as crisp as something from Hogue. It's still got a bit of that rubbery sense that Benchmade Axis locks tend to have, especially on the very ends of that open and that close, but it's fine. And considering that, I don't know, is there even anything that Benchmade makes that's $130 these days? There might be. I can't think of anything right now. The fact is, getting an Axis lock of similar quality and feel to Benchmade's at $130, and if for some reason you don't want a Hogue, this will do the job. This will do the job just fine. The handle design is very simple. These are flat handles, flat G10, relatively limited work on the liners. You know, the steel liners. There's a bit of milling there, which is what gets down to the 2.9 ounces. Nice, light peel ply texture. This is not particularly grippy. Compare this to Spyderco peel ply. This is grippier, not by much, but this is definitely a grippier texture than this here. The edges on this G10 are all contoured rather than chamfered, or at least rounded rather than chamfered, which makes it feel just smoother and more almost like a toy in the hand, which fits the whole aesthetic. I mean, this looks and feels a little bit more like a toy than a tool, but that's intentional by Bent. This is meant to be as inoffensive as a knife can possibly be, and it's fine. The screws are completely fine. There's nothing impressive or negative about the screws. The thumb stud is basically a Benchmade thumb stud. It's fine. The clip is a bent steel clip. It works well. This is a thoroughly, in terms of fit and finish, this is a thoroughly decent knife made in China, $130. There is nothing in here that is worse than I would expect. There is absolutely nothing in here that is better than I would expect. That Axis lock action is pretty good. That might be a little bit better than I would expect, but honestly, that's just because Benchmade pricing is so ridiculous these days. But it is a very good Axis lock for $130. It's a very good Axis lock in general. It's not as good as anything on the market. I prefer the way Tactile did theirs. I prefer the way that the Hogue, the Ritter Hogue, the RSK series did theirs. But it's solid. So, fit and finish. If you're curious, for $130, am I getting my money's worth for fit and finish here? Yeah, it's fine. I still don't think it's quite as precise as something like, I mean, this one isn't $130, but something like a stock native just feels a little crisper than anything here. And the fact that this is made in the USA on top of that. But you're not going to be complaining about what you get for $130 here. And frankly, these take a bath on the secondary market. If you're buying secondary, you can probably get one of these for $100, if even. You can probably get them for under $100 if they're even used a little bit. So let's go into some of the details here. This blade. This blade is both where the Knafs Lander is really good and where it starts to struggle. This, again, it's a very neutral spirit point with not thin stock. It's not thick. It's relatively thin, but especially given how little distal taper there is, how far this flat goes, it's kind of thick behind the edge. Honestly, it's certainly not a great slicer. It's not terrible, and in particular, it's not terrible just because that blade stock is so thin, and so when you're passing through material, there's just not much to pass through that material, but it's far from the sliciest knife that you're going to find, and you can put more aggressive edges on it, things like that. That is going to help. But the fact is, this geometry, just with how shallow this grind is, and in particular, as you get toward the tip, you know, this area sort of up here, which is where you'd want to start a lot of your cuts, ends up feeling a little thick, ends up feeling like it has a bit of a hard time cutting stuff. I did have to push harder than I would like to start cuts with this guy. The blade shape is great. This front belly here is really nice. If I take my pen here, if you're trying to cut into a box, it's really easy to take this sort of front belly and just cut down the edge of the box like that. If you've got something that's standing up and you're trying to cut into it, it is really easy. It's almost like a recurve in the sense that you can just get this behind there and pull through. The blade really naturally pinches from the handle. You can pinch it just like that, as well as you know, holding it further back like that. If you want to hold it further back, it starts to feel a little awkward. The blade starts to feel a little far away, but you can pinch up easily enough that you can get those precise cuts there. This tip pierces, again, relatively well. It's not the blade shape that's harming it there. It's the stock that's harming it. I mean, that is a decently thick tip, especially once you get even a little bit behind the tip. It ends up being a decent blade shape for lightweight EDC stuff where you're not facing a lot of resistance as you cut. And where really, because the nature of what you're cutting, you don't need the sharpest blade in the world, you don't need the grabbiest blade geometry in the world, and you don't need a blade shape that is really going to either stay in the cut or pass through the cut, or even something like a Warmcliffe that's really going to catch the edge of that cut and drag through. But the neutrality of this blade shape, while looking very cool and very inoffensive, just isn't the greatest performer. And especially when I was using this knife to garden, especially when I was cutting lighter plant stems, actually when I was cutting just about anything, it was work to get this blade to get through stuff. And it's not because the edge isn't sharp. The edge is sharp. I mean, this edge here, right now it's not sharp, but it's not that dull. It felt much duller than it was, and a lot of that is just the geometry. The benefit of a short blade like that is this ends up taking up not that much space in the pocket. And if you compare this, I'll pull out my PM2 here. This takes up a lot less space in the pocket than something that is taller like that, like a lot of Spyderco models, things like that. Like even, if you pull out something like and not that it's trying to compete with any of these knives, but you pull out your AD 20.5, takes up less space in the pocket, largely because that blade just sticks out less, and because that blade is less tall. And when I think about what Ben is trying to do here with the Lander 2, it's something that's easy to carry in your pocket, and that shallow blade is part of why. And it probably cuts well enough for your basic EDC, but it's not going to be a high-performance slicer. It's not trying to be, but also don't expect it to be. And know that you are compromising a bit on that performance with this blade shape and with the way it's implemented here. But I've got a few more grievances with this handle. The handle looks really nice. I love Ben's super neutral, almost like smiley happy design language where they're just fun looking knives, especially in this banter blue. They're not taking themselves too seriously. There's no big curves here, and honestly with this, what's basically a giant choil along the bottom and a pretty neutral handle with a big gradual swoop here, then some actual corners on the back, you can pick it up and just grab it, and wherever you grab it, you pull this out of your pocket, you flick it out, wherever your hands are, you can just grab it and you can start working the knife. A neutral handle like this works really easily. By the way, this jimping here, it's not the greatest. It looks nice. I would rather have it here than not have it here. And by the way, you can probably front flip this, but I cannot. But it's mostly ornamental. This blade looks much better with the jimping here, which happens to go right up to the edge of the Knafs logo, which is sort of assigned to me also that it's ornamental, because it's not really thick or grabby enough to give you much actual traction. Like if I go here versus go here, there's not that much difference in how much my thumb is staying in place. This handle is very easy to pick up and grab, to flick out and grab, to pinch up. You can move up and down it however you want to, and that's what neutral handles do, especially skinny neutral handles like this. But it also means that the handle is doing nothing to hold your hand in place. This choil up front here, or the little scoop you've got here, is not enough to keep your hand from running up onto the blade if you start to push this harder. So that means, and you're aware of that while you're using it, so you feel like you gotta really hold on to the knife here. You gotta keep that index finger in there. When you start to push this, there is nothing in this handle that is preventing your hand in the handle from sliding back and forth. The handle is not thick either, so it's not like it's filling your palm. It's kind of fitting along your knuckles right here. And so when you start to grab it, and once you start to push this even moderately, if I compare this to, let's go to something on the complete other extreme. In fact, let me get my lightweight man so it'll show up better on camera. And I'm choosing two extremes here quite deliberately. Something like the Mannix that has a lot of curves like this, whether I put my hand here behind the choil or even up here in this front choil, all of these curves, this one here, this one here, this one here, this curve, and then if I use it, this thumb ramp here, and how it sort of goes into my palm swell, my hand pretty much cannot move unless there's like a harsh impact to this knife. My hand is not going anywhere, and as a result, I don't have to grip it as hard because the knife is sort of holding me back. The knife design is preventing my hand from moving around. The Lander 2 is doing absolutely nothing in that regard. There is no part of this handle that is holding your hand in place while you are using it. And as a result, when you start to press this under even what is, for most knives, moderate use, and I'm talking like pushing through cardboard that's a little bit thicker than usual and stuff like that, you end up feeling like you have to grip this knife really hard just to keep control of it because the handle itself is doing nothing to keep control of itself for you. And so, while the neutral handle looks nice and it leads to a relatively small profile in the pocket, and it makes it very easy for those light duty tasks to just pick it up, cut what you need, pinch it, grab it, slice, whatever, and go, and then pop it back in your pocket, and you got a relatively nice little thing there. For even moderate use tasks, this ended up being a bear to use because I had to do all the work to hold on to the knife. I had to do all the work to control the knife. The knife was not helping me out. It was not helping me get the blade where I wanted to or keep control of the blade as it passed through material. That was all falling to my hand, and so I had to clench this hand on the knife much more than I would have for a more opinionated handle design. Even something like, a native here, even these choils give you so much more control over the blade than something like this. If you compare them, all these choils here, these lock my fingers in. This simply does not. And so, if I look at, the thickness, thickness-wise, I compare this to a PM2. It's not even that much thinner than a PM2. It's very slightly. And when I say very slightly, I mean it might not even be actually thinner. It might even have thicker G10 scales and a thinner blade. So, if anything, I think it is a tiny, tiny bit thinner. But it's not even that much thinner than a PM2. It's definitely smaller in the pocket. If you compare the two like that, again, these aren't comparable knives. This is a hard use knife. This is meant to be a lightweight EDC. But it's not even that much smaller in the pocket, honestly, than something like the PM2. It is lighter, and it's got a much less threatening design. But in my experience, and the implementation of the axis lock is fun and fidgety and nice. But I didn't love carrying this knife because it really only felt good for relatively lightweight tasks. When I started to push this knife even a tiny bit harder, I just didn't love the way the handle felt. And I didn't love the fact that the handle was making me do all the work to keep my grip onto it. And that there is really nothing here that is helping me control that blade other than my own bearing down harder on the handle. Combine that with geometry that is far from being the sliciest thing out there, which means that you are going to have to put more force into every cut. And this knife just felt more laborious than I would have liked to use it. It was nice to carry, didn't take up much space in the pocket, unobtrusive design, the sort of knife that you could hand to somebody relatively easily. But I wouldn't really even want to hand this to somebody because of how just not sharp it could feel sometimes. And, especially if you're somebody who carries knives regularly and knows about knives, you want to hand somebody something that they're going to be impressed by, something that's going to be impressively sharp. And that's something that, if I'm going back to my Spyderco Native or my PM2 or a Capara or even my Chris Reeve or something like that, you're going to have that experience. You're going to get a knife that feels like a premium knife. It is only $135 or $130, so some of that I understand. That's a concession here. And it's not really trying to compete with those, but I even go price for price. The problem is, unless you really love the design, these knives are about the same price. If you really like an axis lock, this one is one of the cheaper axis locks you can get. But then again, why not just get a Ritter RSK if you really want an axis lock? That's a better knife. Frankly, I think even the Hogue Deca, which is not a knife that I'm a huge fan of, but even the Hogue Deca was a better knife than this one. Better ergonomics, kept the knife in your hand much better. Significantly sharper blade out of the factory, sliced much better, stayed sharp longer, and just way more pleasant to use with a better axis lock implementation. This one is not bad, especially at the price point, but the Hogue Deca's is just better. And then, if I compare here, these knives are about the same size. This is the Indela, by the way. But these are about the same size, about the same price, and the Indela is a completely different world in terms of slicing performance and ergonomic performance. And so the problem is, just top of head there, and I mean, don't even bring the native into the picture, the native is not even close. There are multiple knives I can think of right now at or around this price point that are simply better performers than the Knafs Lander 2. Which leads me to believe there's really one reason to buy this knife, which is you think it's fun, and you like Ben, and you like the design. And honestly, those are all pretty compelling reasons. Ben is a very likable guy. Ben's designs are offering something that almost nobody else in the knife industry is offering right now, which is he is offering designs that are just simply fun. They are not taking knife making too seriously, they're not taking knives too seriously, and they're just basically saying, hey, here's a tool that should be nice and easy to carry and should do the things that you need a knife to do. And especially on the first two, he's doing great. And I really love some parts of his design philosophy, and honestly, I think I wouldn't have the issue I have with the handle if this was a slicier blade and didn't make me bear down on this handle so often. If this becomes a slicier blade, then the fact that this doesn't hold my hand in doesn't matter as much because I don't have to bear down as often because this knife is cutting through things more easily. But then when you have a blade that isn't as slicey, the neutrality of this handle starts to harm more than help. And so I wanted to like this knife, and this is sort of, I just before this recorded my review of the Ace Nimbus. The Ace Nimbus V3 was a knife that I hated at first and ended up, let's say, very much liking. Not loving, but very much liking, because this is really, really, really good at a few things, and not so good at things outside those few things, but it's really good at those few things. This knife came out of the box, flipped it around, really good first impression. Then I started to use it, and the more I used it, the less I liked it. And so this feels like the V2 is probably an intermediate step. I never handled a V1, but I have no interest in handling a V1 after handling the V2. This is just simply not a knife for me. And unfortunately, at $130, given the competition at that price point, it's hard for me to recommend this knife to other people either. It's not a bad knife, but I can't think of any particular use case, again, unless you love this design, or any person who this is going to be the best knife in the market at that price point for them. Even if you want an axis lock design, just get the Deca or the RSK. They're both better knives in every practical sense than this one. The Hogue Deca or the Hogue RSK. You guys, if you've watched some of my reviews, you know I love the RSK. That's my preferred option between those two. And they're both better knives than this. So, if you love the design, it'll be fine, but you probably won't love the performance. And if you don't love the design, just wait till the Lander V3, or, hopefully Ben might be better suited trying to step up his price point a little bit further and, looking at some of the higher end OEMs. I don't know how much of this is because of the design and how much of this is Kaiser. I haven't handled a lot of Kaisers. I don't handle a lot of Chinese knives in general. I only handled this one because I kind of like what Ben is doing with Knafs, and honestly, I'm kind of a fan of the banter too. but I don't think I'm going to be checking this out. Checking this out further and checking this line out further, unless Ben gives me a reason to believe that something is going to be different on the performance front than what he did here. Might just not be the knife for me. Might be great for you. It's certainly a fun knife, and it makes me smile in a way. I just don't love using it. So, hope you found that to be a good use of your time, and I will see you again soon.